Hello. In this video, we are going to speak about the cerebral cortex and the cranial nerves. So this is a continuation of the previous lecture that is titled Neuroanatomy and Neurophysiology, or part 2. So now we are going to move on to part 3. We said that the cerebral cortex is the very top layer. You can think of it as a very thin pancake wrapping around the entire cerebrum. Or you can think about the cortex as the tree bark that wraps around a tree trunk. So it is very extensive, and in order to fit into the cranium, it is folded and convoluted, and that's a way to expand its surface. And we said that the cerebral cortex is also called the gray matter. And the cell bodies, most of the cell bodies in the brain reside in the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has 6 layers based on the names of the cells that inhabit each layer. It also has glial cells that support and cushion and surround the neurons. Now, the cerebral cortex has 6 parts. Remember just the cortex that we are discussing. 4 parts are visible on the surface, and each hemisphere has exactly mirror images of the other. So the 6 parts of the cerebral cortex, 4 of them are showing, you can see them easily from outside, and then 2 are buried in between, it's deeper. I'm going to show you. But these are the first 4. We call this area, obviously, the frontal lobe or the frontal cortex. And it is, the reason it is called that is that it is covered by the frontal bone of the skull. The parietal cortex is covered by the parietal bone of the skull. And then the occipital cortex is covered by the occipital bone, and then the temporal cortex or temporal lobe is covered by the temporal bone. And then the 2 other areas or parts of the cortex, you cannot see them from outside. You can see them when you take open up the 2 hemispheres. You are going to see one here that is, see that structure is the corpus callosum that we discussed in the first video. And on top of the corpus callosum, there's one gyrus that goes all the way from the posterior end, right above the corpus callosum, goes all the way around and curves down, and that is called the cingulate gyrus. It is one gyrus that continues from the posterior end to the anterior and wrapping over the corpus callosum. Then the other area I'm going to show you. So again, here's the cingulate gyrus. You cannot see it unless you open up the 2 hemispheres. And here is the insula. And you cannot see it unless you pull down the superior gyrus of the temporal cortex and the parietal end. So it is covered, this area, like little island beneath the foldings of the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. It is covered by these particular areas, and these areas we call them each one operculum. So operculum in Latin means the lid of a pan, the cover of a pan. So these areas serve to cover this this insula or insular cortex, and they are called the opercula. So this first part is called the frontal operculum, and then this part is called the parietal operculum, and this temporal one is called the temporal operculum. All of these areas, this area and this, are critical language areas. And the insula contributes to language also, and we'll talk about the functions. But these insula and cingulate gyrus and the four lobes make up the parts of the cerebral cortex. The general functions for the entire cerebral cortex, the overall functions, it contributes, it is what gives us cognition. And if I ask you in the exam, the functions, you can't just say cognitive functions, language. No, you need to make yourself more specific. You need to say it enables us to perform cognitive operations or cognitive functions. It enables us to comprehend language and to express language. It enables us to understand emotions and to react to emotions and to process emotions. It enables us to perform sensory functions by bringing sensation from the different parts of the body up to try to interpret them and to make sense out of our sensations. So don't just list what's on the slides. You need to listen to what the lecture says, and the purpose why I am recording and not giving you this to just simply read is to, explain. So do not rely on what I list on the slides. What I list here is for you to be able to just be organized and to put information in an organized way. But I am here to explain to you what these functions are. So in the exam, please don't just memorize and list functions from the slides. Motor functions, the cerebral cortex also, especially the frontal part of it, the frontal lobe, enables us to plan movement and to execute movements by, and move organs, different organs of our body. So these are the general functions. We are going to, now in the next segment about the cerebral cortex, we are going to take each part, look at the major landmarks, the major areas that particularly enable us to perform speech or language functions, and then discuss these major functions of these areas in every lobe. So part of what you need to understand is be able to label, to identify each lobe or part of the cortex, give it a name, be able to identify the major landmarks. If I say to you, for example, where is the motor cortex, you need to come here and very precisely make a line here, go down, come up, make a line around the area, identify its boundaries completely precisely, and then in the arrow you'll write and say the motor cortex, for example. So be very, very careful when you have questions to label about labeling areas. Know the areas, what each lobe has. And like here says the auditory cortex, for example, the auditory association cortex, Wernicke's area will be here. So we'll be explaining all the different areas that are important for language and speech in every lobe or every part of the cortex, and then we'll explain the functions of each one. So this is what the actual brain looks like. In between here you can see the fissure, the longitudinal fissure. But before we go here, when you look, you see these areas that are convoluted, and the area that is rising up like a hill, that is called a gyrus. The areas in between that are like valleys are called sulci. One is called sulcus. If the sulcus is too deep, Sometimes you call it fissure, like the longitudinal fissure, and the temporal fissure, and the central fissure. So all of these can be called fissures, but most of the time, I mean, especially the longitudinal fissure, it's called fissure. It's not called sulcus. But some of the other ones, occasionally you find maybe a reference referring to lateral sulcus or central sulcus. But these big valleys, or the big, we call them fissures. It's more the small ones that are not as deep are called sulci from sulcus. So I needed to know where each fissure is, or which major sulci are, and tell me, for example, where it exists. Like, say, if I ask a question about where is the longitudinal fissure, you said the longitudinal fissure splits the the cerebrum in two parts. It splits it to make the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and it is in between the hemispheres. You need to say it goes from all the way and from the front, and it goes all the way posteriorly to the very end of the brain. So the longitudinal fissure, again, this is what exactly said, goes from the rostral end of the brain to the caudal end, dividing the brain into, or the cerebrum into two hemispheres. So that this way you identify it and tell us exactly where it is located. The central fissure sometimes is also called the central sulcus, or the Rolandic fissure, or the fissure of Rolando. So here, in between the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex, you find two gyri continuous going from the very superior end of one hemisphere way to the very end, to the inferior end of that hemisphere. So next to the temporal lobe. So these two, as they go continuously from this end to that, here's one and here's one. In between them, there is a fissure, and we call that the Rolandic fissure, or the central sulcus, because central, it's like in the center of the brain, so it divides, it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So here, the exact location of it, it lies horizontally on the center of each hemisphere, and it extends from the longitudinal fissure superiorly, and extends inferiorly to the end of the lateral fissure, or to the temporal cortex. The temporal fissure is the fissure that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and from the parietal. That sometimes is also called the Sylvian fissure, or the fissure of Sylvius. So it has more than one name. Sometimes it's called the temporal fissure, sometimes the lateral fissure. So I'd like you to know all these names. You are welcome to use any of them, that is fine, but know all of them in case you see a reference that refers to, uses one term instead of the other. So if you know all of them, you know that it is the same structure. It is not a new structure. So that is the temporal fissure, and the parieto-occipital sulcus, it separates, from the name of it, the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and you can see it, clearly, more visibly when you open the two hemispheres. So this is where it is, the parieto-occipital sulcus, and it continues between the two hemispheres, as you can see. It's perpendicular to the longitudinal fissure and extends posteriorly to the borders of the temporal cortex here, and separates the occipital lobe from the parietal. So now let's look at the major parts again and look at what the functions of each. So you need to, as you look here, you need to exactly be able to answer the following questions. For example, going back to the cortex, you need to be able to label different parts on a map, and also to be able to name the 6 major parts of this cortex. What are the major boundaries? For example, the fissures and sulci. What are they? Where are they located? What do they separate? What are the structures they separate? We know the 6 parts of the cortex, and also know the boundaries of each part. So if I say to you, where is the temporal cortex? You need to say it is located, for example, under the temporal bone. It is inferior to the parietal lobe and to the frontal lobe. It is separated from the parietal and frontal lobes by the temporal fissure. So you need to be able to identify, to describe the location of each of these parts. And also you need to identify the major areas, the major landmarks of each lobe or each structure, and know the functions of each of these landmarks, and know the functions of every lobe or every part of the cortex as a whole. You need to know the Brodmann areas of each of these areas that I speak about. In terms of the cranial nerves, that is to come yet, you need to be able to identify the number of each nerve that we will discuss. You need to know if the nerve is sensory, if it is motor, if it has motor and sensory functions, or if it is mixed. Mixed means it has sensory, motor, and autonomic functions. You need to know the functions of each of these nerves, what it does, what areas it actually innervates, and again, the function of each, what functions does each nerve facilitate. So these are the questions you should be able to answer by the end of this recorded lecture. And if you can't answer them, you need to go back again. Remember that this lecture goes with your textbook, with the assigned chapter in the textbook, and you are responsible for both the textbook and this lecture. Because the two, I mean, this is mostly based on your chapter. Okay, sorry, the computer is a bit slow, acting crazy. Okay, so begin with the cingulate gyrus. We'll take the areas that are hidden first, because they tend to be neglected, and when you ask people to identify or to state the areas of the cortex, they just only name the 4 lobes and that's it. But we begin with the ones that are hidden first. So the cingulate gyrus is buried inside the longitudinal fissure between the 2 hemispheres, and it extends from the posterior end of the cerebrum to the anterior end, like that. And it lies on top of the corpus callosum. So the functions of this gyrus are to analyze your thoughts, to help informing a language script. Before you speak, before you even perform movement and stuff, you formulate a script in what you are going to see and what you are going to do. In terms of the motor script, you rehearse, your brain calculates the movements and rehearse them and so on. And there are two areas in the very center here of the cingulate gyrus, two areas that lie beneath the supplementary motor cortex. These two areas here serve motor functions, contribute to the planning of motor movements. And the other areas here contribute to the formation of language scripts. Before you speak, your brain is going to figure out what to say, how to assemble the words and sentences and so on, and how to, edit them and make the script functional before you connect it with muscles. The anterior part is important for, actually, the various parts of it are important for emotional regulation. And also, like I mentioned, the middle areas here are dedicated to planning and movement. The insula, sometimes it's called the insular cortex. If you decide to take the word cortex out, you need to say the insula. Insular is a descriptor. You just shouldn't call it the insular. There's nothing called the insular. So you either call it the insula or the insular cortex. So it's involved in both speech motor functions, and also it's the center that gives you your intuition, your gut feeling. It connects your unconscious thought process with your conscious thought process. And it is what gives you the sensation of, like, say, butterflies in the stomach, or if you see something very, very bad and devastating, you feel like as if you are punched in the stomach. This is what transforms your emotions into feelings that you are consciously aware of. It transfers your feelings into physical sensations. And also, it is a major part of something called the brain default mechanism that is contributing to our intuition or gut feelings. The frontal lobe of the brain is a very, very important lobe. It has your voluntary movement centers, your planning for movement, and it has the syntax. So we'll discuss the major functions and the major landmarks. Generally, the frontal cortex lies anterior to the central fissure and extends all the way anteriorly, and it is until it is part of it, a big part is covered by the forehead, and it lies superior to the temporal cortex and anterior to the parietal cortex. The major landmarks of the frontal lobe include the motor cortex. Sometimes it is referred to as the primary motor cortex. The areas inside which the motor cortex is the gyrus that is anterior to the central fissure. So the central fissure, because of its location, that sulcus that's anterior to it, we call that sulcus the pre-means anterior, the pre-central gyrus. I'm sorry, not sulcus, gyrus. The pre-central gyrus. That is when you refer to it based on anatomy. So based on anatomy, that is called the precentral gyrus. Based on its function, what does it do? It is called the primary motor cortex, or simply the motor cortex. So this area we'll discuss is what has a map of your body, and every organ is represented, and every part that you move voluntarily is controlled by neurons that start here. And then the other areas anterior to the motor cortex, these are planning areas. This is called the pre-motor area. And then we have Broca's area here, that is for language, for syntax, say grammar, and for speech production. And if you go anteriorly, you have a big area here called the frontal association cortex, and then you have the prefrontal cortex. So if you make a line from here down, everything in the front here is called the prefrontal cortex. So the there's another area called the supplementary motor area, supplementary motor cortex. That is the area that is anterior to the motor cortex and superior to the premotor area. So that's the premotor area, and superior to it is the supplementary motor area. So if you look here and look at the primary motor cortex here, and you just have a coronal cut of the brain. So this is what you have. You have now the two, hemispheres, left and right. But what they're happening is that they have this area, the motor cortex here, and see how this is the post-central gyrus, or the somatosensory cortex. They have it represented on the other side, but both of them are just cut coronally. So you can see now this margin here is the gray matter, and out of it extend all the axons coming down, and all of these come together. I'm going to show you. So all of this, they just come together, that the axons from them come together and go down, so that they finally eventually connect with your muscles, and you can move your muscles. So you could see how the organization is. If someone sits, for example, sits on top here, in between the two fissures, and lies down back like this little man, and extends like this, the areas within the longitudinal fissure, these areas innervate your toes, your leg, the entire leg, and then your torso, and then your arm, your fingers, and then the 1/3 of it, the inferior 1/3, innervates your face and your neck. So 1/3 of the cortex is dedicated to speech production, to swallowing, and to functions that have to do with the face and the neck. So then I'm going to explain briefly what the functions are. So the motor cortex, the functions of it are to actually move this, basic structures that we want to move voluntarily, like your hand, your arm, your tongue, your lips, and so on. And then the premotor cortex, that is dedicated to mostly planning, and it stores information about motor movements. So when you do a movement, you do not have to relearn it. It can be stored here and it can serve as a bank that you could use to perform the movement next time and even more accurately. The supplementary motor cortex that is here, it is dedicated to editing speech scripts, what you are going to say, and kind of refining it and making it suitable for performance, and then before that script goes to the motor cortex to be executed. And then we have Broca's area, that is area 44 and 45, and that lies at the foot, anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. And the Broca's area lies again, it lies in the inferior posterior segment of the temporal lobe above, of the frontal lobe above the temporal lobe. The frontal association cortex is dedicated to integration of information that comes from the parietal cortex, from the temporal cortex, some from the visual cortex. All of this information finds its way to the association cortex so that you can relate what you hear, what you see, what you feel to the plan, to your intentions, and to your actions and reactions. The prefrontal cortex is dedicated to working, it is a major contributor to decision making, working memory, intention to speak or intention to plan movement, executive functions, determining what you want to do and then how to do it and how to monitor yourself while you are doing it, and so on. So this is the primary motor cortex again, as a major area. Broca's area is going to be here. The premotor area, supplementary motor area here, and then the prefrontal cortex. So again, the premotor area, some of its neurons also contribute directly to the pathway that goes from the primary auditory cortex to the brain stem, and that pathway is important for movement. And so the premotor area sends down some of the neurons to contribute to movement itself. But it's mostly dedicated to motor planning and motor execution. There's a pathway that goes from the premotor cortex, goes from here down to here. That's the premotor cortex. Next to it is the Broca's area. So the premotor cortex has a pathway that leads to the parietal cortex. And the parietal cortex has to do with your sensations and with the location of your muscles and your body in space. So it has maps of movement and maps of movement in space, and it sends its information to the premotor cortex so that you can, it's like an engineer, you want to plan how to build a building, then you go and get the maps from the parietal cortex, and then work on making your plan on how to structure, how to build the actual building. So the premotor cortex is a major component that enables us to rehearse movements before we do them, to make sure that the brain just acts out the movement so many times, just like you rehearse for a play. And then that area helps determine how much energy is used, what is the most efficient way to perform the movement without having to consume as much energy. So it serves as a bank also for storing movements that you already have done, so that you do not have to relearn how to walk, for example, or how to shake hands, or how to do movements. You don't have to relearn them every time you do them. So you perform a movement, you store it, and then what you store there becomes a kind of a template for movements that follow, and for you to be able to do the same movement again and repeat it. So it contributes to activation of movements because some of its fibers go directly also to be part of the pyramidal tract. That pyramidal tract connects with your nerves and facilitates movement. So the supplementary motor area, as I explained, it's located anterior to the primary motor cortex and superior to the premotor area or the premotor cortex, and it extends in between the two hemispheres. So this is where you find it, supplementary motor area, and beneath it you could see the cingulate gyrus. You could see the two major motor areas that are part of the cingulate gyrus, and these two, the supplementary motor cortex, works in coordination with the motor areas of the supplementary motor cortex, of the cingulate gyrus. So it contributes to motor planning, to editing of the motor script before you perform the movement. It contributes, basically it's important for physical production of speech. Then the frontal lobe, as I mentioned, is an extensive lobe. It's a big lobe, and it has this part, most anterior area that we know as the prefrontal cortex. And that area, these are some of the major functions of it. For example, it facilitates, when it works with the brainstem, it facilitates alertness and awareness, attention functions in different areas, emotional regulation, control of your emotions, motor control, how to perform a movement, how to direct it and control it, inhibitory control, when do you stop, how do you, for example, avoid doing things you shouldn't do, or avoid saying things that you should not do. It is that is called inhibitory control. Your motivation, what makes you motivated to do something. Problem solving, making judgments about things, like you are driving and the light is changing. When do you stop? Do you stop as you come close? How do you determine that you are close enough so when you go through the light that you do not violate, you don't have a violation? So all of these judgment calls are made very quickly and by the prefrontal cortex. Decision making, social communication, integration of language and cognitive abilities, all of that is in the prefrontal cortex. Regulation of yourself, regulation of your behavior and your emotions. Now, Broca's area lies anterior to the foot of, anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex. It is showed here. Exactly, the premotor cortex. Anterior to it is Broca's area, right there, where the arrows are. So Broca's area, it has lexical processing functions, like where words are stored and processed. It stores grammatical rules, and also it enables us to program speech movements before we perform them. So, and then once these speech movements are programmed and planned and rehearsed, then they go to the primary motor cortex to actually execute the actions. It contributes to language comprehension a great deal because the comprehension areas work with the production areas. Comprehension is facilitated greatly by their grammar, by syntax. And syntax is facilitated by the comprehension of words and meanings and so on. So Broca's area works very closely with Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area for language recognition, for speech recognition, and for language comprehension. But the two cannot be done separately. In order to comprehend, you need to understand the grammar, the grammatical function, and so on of particular words and sentences. And in order to produce these, you need to comprehend their meaning as well. So the two areas work together. It also contributes to the rehearsal of the speech motor commands before we perform speech. Broca's area is Brodmann areas 44 and 45. A scientist at the beginning of the century, his name was Corbinian Brodmann. He divided the cortex, the entire cortex, into 52 areas, labeling them area number 1, 2, 3, until you go 52. And each area is unique in its composition and the functions. And we know these areas as Brodmann area 1, 2, 3, and so on. So Brodmann areas 1 and 2, for example, and 3 are here in the parietal cortex. Brodmann area 44, 45 together, they make up Broca's area. So you need to know these Brodmann areas by name. In the superior temporal gyrus, in the posterior segment of it, you have Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is connected with Broca's area by a structure called the arcuate fasciculus. It's a bidirectional pathway. It's a two-way street where Wernicke's area sends information to Broca's area, and Broca's area sends back, information. Both of them exchange information so that you can produce and comprehend language. You can see Wernicke's area, Broca's area, and this area is called the primary cortex, but we'll discuss it in the temporal lobe. But know for now that Broca's area is connected to Wernicke's area by the arcuate fasciculus, and that the arcuate fasciculus is a bidirectional pathway that connects comprehension with language expression and motor production and syntax. The temporal lobe is dedicated basically to comprehension, to memory, to emotional processing, and it is separated from the anterior and parietal lobes, or the frontal lobes and the parietal. It's separated by the temporal fissure, or the lateral fissure, or the lateral sulcus, or the fissure of Rolando. Sylvius, or Sylvian fissure. It has many names. So the major landmarks here are Wernicke's area, here, and that's area 21, Wernicke's area. And then the auditory association cortex, that is Brodmann area 22, and the medial temporal lobe, cortex, And the primary auditory cortex, that's on the superior and the middle, superior temporal gyrus. So you need to really know the locations of each. The middle of the superior temporal gyrus, there are two little areas together, area 41 and area 42. Both of them make the primary auditory cortex. You need to understand that Broca's area only exists in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area exists only in the left hemisphere. And the anatomy, not the anatomy, I mean the function, only this particular area, even though it has a mirror image on the other side, only in the left hemisphere, only this area is what facilitates what is called Broca's area. Only this area and this location in the left hemisphere is called Wernicke's area because it does these functions. So this, and deeper inside of this lobe, you also will find the amygdala and you will find the hippocampus. And both of them are central parts for the learning process, for memory, and for emotional processing. So this Wernicke's area again, and these are the main functions of it. It is dedicated to the phonemic assembly, putting sounds together to make words. It works with the primary auditory cortex and the association cortex. It contributes to the matching of words with their meaning, with their linguistic meaning, and also contributes heavily to written language and helps us monitor our speech production by listening to ourselves and determining if there is a problem with, for example, with what we are saying, how we say it. The parietal lobe here is located posterior to the central fissure. It is posterior to the frontal cortex. So this blue area here, the gyrus, that is, hold on, let me go back. So this gyrus here, that is called the somatosensory cortex, and that it also has a map that provides that of the sensation in your body. So, for example, here's the primary motor cortex, and that is part of the frontal lobe, and the somatosensory cortex, that is part of the parietal lobe, and that somatosensory cortex lies posterior to the central gyrus, or the central fissure, or the fissure of Rolando. This gyrus is also called the post-central gyrus. That is an anatomic name. So the functional name of it, what does it do? It is called the somatosensory, or the primary somatosensory cortex. And if you could see it here, you can see that between the two hemispheres, the areas of it provide you sensations from your toes, your foot, your ankle, and so on. And you go down until all the lowest area here is dedicated to your face and your tongue and your neck and so on. So this area enables you, for example, to move your lips. This area gives you feeling from your lips as they move. So all of this gives you sensation from different parts of the body. That's, again, for that reason. The other areas of the parietal cortex, they serve sensory functions. They enable you to feel your body in movement and being in space. How do you move your tongue left, right, up, down, and the space that it has there? How do you move your muscles? So all of this has to do with sensation. And this little man that is drawn on the to show the functions of the sensory cortex is called the sensory homunculus. Homunculus means little man, So the other homunculus that is drawn on the motor cortex, that is called the motor homunculus. Again, it's just a little man mapped on top of that to show, to represent the functions of each gyrus. Okay. All right. So these are the general functions of the parietal lobe, including, because it has to do with space and orientation of the body and the muscles and the structures in space, and with the sensations from your body. It enables us to locate objects, to manipulate objects, like close your hands and have someone put an object in your hand. You notice if the person puts an object like this, you will never be able, if you are closing your eyes, you will never be able to know what it is, what there is there. How do you know? Immediately when you give someone something like this, you say, now tell me what it is. You will notice they immediately will start to take the thing and put their fingers around it, and then immediately they will tell you what this is. The reason is the fingers have stations. Each one has a station, has a map that connects to your parietal cortex. When you sense something with your fingertips, you can actually physically read it. You can get information from it, the texture, the feeling of it. Is it hot? Is it warm? Is it cold? Is it hard? Is it soft? And so on. All of that information enables you to read whatever object you have. To the extent that people use it to read Braille, to read language, just like you read language with your eyes. People who are blind, they will use their fingertips to read Braille, to read just like you read. The little binky doesn't have as much, but it does have, the major ones are the thumb and these three fingers. The little one has a little bit, not as extensive as the other ones. So, touch perception, goal-directed voluntary movement is it gives you sensations about how your movement goes. How you manipulate objects by using your fingertips to actually move things around them, feel them, and say what they have, what these. So the parietal lobe also enables us to integrate different senses, for example, that enable us to construct the components of a concept. For example, when you say the word hammer, you listen to the sounds of hammer, and in terms of phonetics, for example, and at the same time, you need to understand the meaning, what hammer means. So the understanding and the comprehension and also thinking about how to say the word hammer is all in these areas in here. Wernicke's area, Broca's area, the motor cortex. But then you want to get information. The parietal cortex gives you information about how you hold the hammer, how you move a hammer, how your hand feels as you move a hammer, for example. So when you write, the parietal cortex is going to give you kind of feedback about how you move your hand to curve and to make letters. So it enables us to integrate what the letters we see with the letters that we actually, move. So motor functions integrated with sensory functions, with visual functions, with auditory functions, and so on. It enables us to attend to have, to attend to more than one object at the same time. That is like part of work and memory functions. It enables us to name objects, to kind of look at an object and, to say what it is. The parietal lobe enables us to locate words as we are reading and writing. It enables us to draw objects because it has to do with the space, how our muscles and our joints and body parts move in the space confinements, and how it gives us feedback in comparison from our muscles. That is called proprioceptive feedback, the feedback that we get from our joints and from our muscles. It enables us to locate things in the environment, like finding your directions to a place, locating your car in a garage, for example, locating things. It enables us to be aware of different body parts as they move in a particular location, and to focus visual attention. It enables us to have eye-hand coordination, for example. So if I go point to my, say, nose, point to my eye, that is called eye-hand coordination. The visual cortex is the functional name of the occipital cortex, or the occipital lobe. So because of that is dedicated to vision, it is called the primary visual cortex, and it is located posterior to the temporal cortex and inferior to the parietal cortex. It contributes to higher level visual processing. For example, we can process things moving at different speeds, for example, and it enables you to look at an image and put all the pixels together from an image and be able to see it as a whole image. It is very important, obviously, for reading, because you use your eyes to read, even if you use Braille somehow. If you use Braille somehow, the information goes to the temporal cortex to be comprehended as well. Now, in the remaining segment, we are going to speak about the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system, as I mentioned earlier, and they come out along the brain stem, beginning with the first nerve, the olfactory nerve or olfactory bulb, and then you go down to the visual nerves that are three. So the first one is smell, second one is vision, but it is sensory. For example, it is your pupil. So your pupil can be dilated, can be constricted. So that is sensory. Connecting what you see with your auditory, with your visual system. And then there are two, so cranial nerve number 3 and number 4, also vision. For example, moving the eyes left and right and up and down. These are critical for scanning, visual scanning of the horizontal scanning and vertical scanning. When we read, we trace from left to right or right to left or up and down. So these are important for reading and for visual, tracking things. And then you skip 5, you go to 6. Cranial nerve number 6 serves visual functions. So again, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Vision and sensory and motor for vision. And number 1 is smell. Then the rest of them basically enable us to perform speech and language functions. So you go to number 5, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All of these contribute to speech and language. Again, remember that if you split draw a line here, you are going to have whatever you have on the left side, you have a mirror image of it in the right side. And the cranial nerves are listed from the very top of the brain stem down to the very end of it down, and each one is written in Latin numerals, and each one has a name, a particular name that you need to know. So, for example, this is CN1, cranial nerve 1. What is it? It's called the olfactory nerve. Number 2, cranial nerve 2, CN2. That is called the optic nerve. And that is the function of it. Each nerve has a certain function. Some nerves only bring sensation. Some nerves can move different structures, and you call them, if it's sensation, you call it sensory, like the auditory nerve. We just enables us to hear, so we call it's a sensory nerve. A nerve that, say, moves our lips, that, nerve becomes motor, So there are motor nerves, and there are sensory nerves, and there are nerves that are motor and sensory, and there are nerves that are mixed. They have sensory, they have motor, and autonomic. They move parts involuntarily. So this, what you need again to know about a nerve is its number, its name, and also if it's sensory, motor, or mixed, and what areas it innervates, and what the specific functions that it enables us to perform. So the optic nerve, 2, vision and visual acuity. The second one, oculomotor, for moving the reaction to light and moving your eyelids, moving your eyes up and down, visual tracking, fixation, for example, and light reflexes, like when you see a bright light, all of a sudden you immediately blink your eyes. And the trochlear nerve is upward and downward and lateral movement, like this. And then the abducens nerve is for lateral movement of the eyes. You notice here between 4 and you move directly to 6, to 6. So number 5 is not listed here because it is part of the speech ones. So 5 is called the trigeminal nerve. Again, it's cranial nerve number 5, like this. And then the name of it is the trigeminal nerve. Geminus means twin. So tri means 3. Trigeminal, it means the 3 twins. So you have 3 pairs of twins. When you have the right side, left side, cranial nerve 5 here, and cranial nerve 5 on the other side. Each one controls half of the face. So a lower branch controls the jaw and the teeth. The middle branch controls the area here, the nose, as you could see, nasal area, and the maxilla here. And of course the teeth that are in the maxilla. The upper branch is going to innervate the forehead and part of the scalp, and then the nose. So each area, as you could see, is going to. So that is the anatomic divisions of it are the ophthalmic branch, that is the top one here, and then the maxillary branch that innervates the area that covered the maxilla, and then the mandibular branch in the jaw, and the as you can see it here. So the functional divisions of it are sensory and motor. So it enables us to have sensation from the face, these different parts of the face, and it enables us to move different structures that are part of, like for example, the jaw, structures that are part of the cheek muscles here, and muscles that are here, for example, the nose. So the sensory branch, sensory functions of it, sensory parts of it, enable us to carry sensation from the skin. Cutaneous means skin, has to do with skin. and proprioceptive sensation. So proprioceptive is the sensation you get from the movement of the muscle as it stretches or as it contracts, I mean, and the movement from the joints. This is called proprioceptive movement or sensation. So from the skin, from the muscles, joints, and of the face and of the mouth. And the motor functions of it, the motor parts of it, activate the muscles for mastication, the muscles that you use to chew food, and also the muscles of the jaw that you use to open your jaw up and down. So again, trigeminal, when the two branches, the ophthalmic branches, right and left, they make like a twin. And then the lower ones, they make another twin. And so this is where you get the name trigeminal or cranial nerve number 5. So damage to the cranial nerve, to this cranial nerve, is going to cause decreased sensitivity or numbness on the face. And it also could cause brief attacks of severe facial pain. It's called trigeminal neuralgia, very painful, and weakness or wasting of the jaw muscles, and also asymmetric chewing, that is if one side is damaged and the other is not. Then the facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, and it is a mixed nerve. Sensory branches, motor, and autonomic. And you could see it here. For example, here is the map that shows you where it is, the sensory. For example, the blue, for example, orange motor, and yellow is, for example, motor. So it labels them based on what each branch does. So the sensory functions of it include carrying sensation from the skin of the external ear canal, for example, like here, for example, external ear canal. And also taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So you could see, for example, here the anterior 2/3 are innervated by this branch. The motor parts of it activate muscles of facial expression, like the labial muscles, the cheek muscles, and also the stylohyoid muscle, the stapedius, and the posterior belly of the digastric. These names, all these muscles should be familiar to you because we extensively covered them in the class. And the autonomic, remember, autonomic means functions that you do not control consciously, and this includes salivary glands, lacrimal glands for crying, blood vessel dilation and contraction of the blood vessels inside of the cerebral cortex. So, for example, here's the lacrimal gland. When it is activated by the nerve, it releases tears. Here are salivary glands here, so that when they're activated, you release saliva, and that helps you digest your food, break down your food and digest it. Damage to the facial nerve causes Bell's palsy, and it is kind of a paralysis on one side of the face, as you could see here, and parts of that is dry cornea because of the inability to close the eyelids. They don't blink. So the reason, as you blink every time, you bring a layer of moisture and kind of moisten the cornea, but if you don't have that, that will cause dryness. And also the sound, if parts of this nerve are damaged, the parts that have to do with the ear and the tensing the ossicles, like in the middle ear, then that is going to cause the sound to be booming, to have a booming quality, because the ossicles are not tense enough. Then comes cranial nerve number 8, which is the vestibulocochlear nerve. We discussed that when we spoke about the auditory system, and we explained how the vestibular nerve comes out of the vestibular canals, semicircular canals, and how, as it exits, it combines with the cochlear nerve or the auditory nerve, and then they two together, they form the vestibulocochlear nerve, and then they connect with the brain stem at the junction of the medulla oblongata and the pons. So this is a nerve that is sensory, and it has a vestibular branch, as I mentioned, and the cochlear branch. And each one, the vestibular has to do with balance, the auditory has to do with hearing and sensation from hearing. Then the glossopharyngeal, that is cranial nerve number 9, and you can see it coming out of the brain stem, and then innervating parts of the pharynx, glosso, and then pharyngeal. So parts of the pharynx and parts of the tongue, especially the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So it's going to enable you to have certain functions. So it enables us to have taste from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, for example, taste particularly sweet, bitter, sour, and also the posterior palate and the tonsillar fossae, or what we know as the fascial pillars that we discussed before. You remember the fascial pillar is made, the anterior wall is made out of the palatoglossal muscle, or the palatoglossus. So the motor functions or motor branches of this nerve, they innervate the stylopharyngeal styloid process, pharynx, the stylopharyngeal muscle, and that enables us to raise and dilate the pharynx so that you can swallow. The autonomic branch innervates the salivary glands that are below the ears, because look, see where that nerve is located, branches are. So that is, here's the ear, below the ear there are salivary glands. So when you chew, then these glands will be squeezed out when innervated by this nerve. They will be squeezed out, will release saliva, to be mixed with what you eat. The biggest nerve is number 10. This is the biggest cranial nerve, and it goes down through the neck, and as it passes down, it innervates the vocal folds and different parts of the pharynx. It goes down then into the trunk, it enters the trunk, innervates your heart, your lungs, your intestines, your internal organs, liver, stomach. So all the internal organs are basically innervated by it, and two branches out of it come out to innervate the diaphragm. These branches are called the phrenic nerve, or if you say the two sides or just one side, it's called the phrenic nerve. It comes out of the vagus nerve as well. So it has sensory functions, motor functions, autonomic. It's a mixed nerve, very extensive, very big. It enables us to have sensation from the posterior pharynx, from the larynx, the thoracic and abdominal organs, of course, and it also enables us to contribute to the taste from the posterior part of the tongue. So the posterior part of the tongue is innervated by the vagus and by the glossopharyngeal. So now we have, if there is dysfunction along the vagus nerve, that could cause damage, it could cause hoarseness, because the vocal folds are innervated by branches from the cranial, from the vagus nerve. And parts of the larynx, that part is innervated by that branch that is called the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which arises from the vagus nerve. So hoarseness mostly due to unilateral paralysis, like paralysis of one side, one vagus nerve on one side, and the other one would be intact mostly. Difficulty with swallowing, because again it innervates the many parts here in the pharynx, and loss of the gag reflex. The accessory nerve basically is what controls the shoulder movement, enables you to shrug like this. And it's cranial nerve number 11. It's a motor nerve. It also helps control or innervate muscles of the neck. So intrinsic muscles of the larynx, pharynx, and soft palate. And the lateral movement and stability of the neck is also controlled by this nerve as it contributes to movement. And the shoulder muscles as well, for example, to force, lifting up your shoulders or shrugging. Lesions in there is going to cause inability to turn the head away from the site of lesion. So if the site of lesion is here, the damage is here, and you can't turn your head away from the site of that damage. So wasting of the neck and weakened rotation, difficulty rotating the neck, and inability to shrug your shoulders. And then we have this is the accessory nerve as it goes down, and you can see how it innervates muscles of the neck and it goes down to innervate the shoulder. The next nerve is the hypoglossal nerve, and that is, hypo means below, glossus means tongue, the nerve that is beneath the tongue, or that innervates the inferior parts of the tongue. Basically, the geniohyoid, the intrinsic tongue muscles, the posterior, parts of the tongue, the stylohyoid. So, lesions to the hypoglossal nerve are going to cause wasting of the tongue with deviation of to one side. I mean, like, for example, if there's lesion on this side, then the tongue is going to deviate to the side that is not damaged, because the side that is damaged is weak and it can't pull back. So it is, for example, here, look at my face. If one side is damaged, the other one is contracted. Like, if you see someone like this, that means that this side that is contracted is functioning well. This side is just letting itself be pulled. It can't pull back. Your face is the way that it is because this side of this side, the muscles pull this way and these muscles pull this way, and they keep a balance. And this is how you stabilize this side with this side equally symmetrical. But if one side is damaged, it will be pulled away by the other side that is intact. Difficulty with the oral stage of swallowing. For example, food will accumulate on the surface of the tongue and inside of the cheeks, because this tongue movement is very important for clearing the tongue and moving the food from one side to the other and moving it and mixing it with saliva and so on. So if there's damage in there and the tongue can't perform these movements, then the food will accumulate there, will cause problems. Difficulty with speech articulation, obviously, because that, look at this muscle, how big it is. You'll have difficulty saying alveolar sounds and difficulty saying palatal sounds, difficulty saying sounds where you have to protrude your tongue between your teeth. So a lot of speech problems are gonna be caused by that. Well, that is the end of the lecture, and I hope that you look at the questions that I gave you. But again, I'm going to reiterate the questions I want you to know, and by the time at this point, you should be able to answer all these questions that have to do with this lecture. So, if you aren't able to answer these questions without going back to the lecture and to your notes and to your textbook, then you need to go back and review again. You need to understand these are questions based on the recorded videos. So, know the cerebrum, what the parts are, and the 6 parts. Know the location exactly of each and the functions of each part. And take each part of the cerebrum, like the frontal cortex or the parietal cortex, each part of these, know the general functions of it, and the major landmarks, the major areas of it, and take these areas and discuss the functions of each in detail. For example, the landmarks in the frontal lobe are, for example, the primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor area, the premotor area, Broca's area, the prefrontal cortex, the association cortex. All of these you need to know as I discussed them. And know the same landmarks in the temporal cortex, landmarks in the parietal cortex, landmarks in the I mean, we didn't really discuss much of landmarks in the occipital. But be able to answer questions like, where is the primary motor cortex located? What is the motor homunculus? What is the sensory homunculus? Where is the sensory cortex located? What lobe? What boundaries exactly? Be able to identify this on a map and just draw, a line around, like an exact line around each one, so that you can identify them on the image of the brain, and also explain their functions. What are okay. The cerebral cortex. So again, the cranial nerves, know the number of the nerve, its name, and if it's sensory motor or or if it is mixed. Know the areas it supplies or innervates, and the functions that it enables us to perform. And that's it basically for this section. Of course, all of this you'll find also in your study guide. So I hope that you review these videos more than once, and that you take good notes, and that you do well. You have basically the study guide tells you everything that you need to know about the final. So I wish you the best, and contact me with any questions. Thank you.